Hey everyone, it's Pittico from Daydream Nation, and I've got a special guest from the Contrarians, the Parish of Rock. How are you, sir?
I'm very good, thank you. Delighted to be here. Big fan of the show, so thanks for inviting me on. Really appreciate it.
Great having you on. Great having you on. Tonight we are going to talk about a English band which is as English as pints of lager, pork pies, and football. And I'm talking about Status Quo. So we are going to pick one album that we would take to a desert island, which would best represent the status quo sound. And I'm not talking about 12 golden bars, no greatest hits. It's got to be one studio album. So we'll talk about why we like that album, maybe spotlight a couple of songs, take it in turns. Desert Island Quo, Parish of Rock. What is the Status Quo album that you choose to take to the desert island?
Right, okay, well, I found this quite a tough challenge, and I narrowed it down initially to three albums. And even up to early in the week, I couldn't decide which of the three I was going to actually bring. So what I decided was I made a list of what Quo means to me, really. And I thought that would help me decide between the three. So I'm just going to bring up my list so I've got it here. So I sort of wrote down 10 things that Status Quo means to me. So the first thing was the look. There's a look to them, the double denim, the heads down, sort of as they're playing, as I've got on pictures behind me.
Yeah.
So the look is really important. The second thing is the sound, which is very distinctive, that kind of heads down, no nonsense, minus boogie type of sound. So that's really important to me for Quo. The next is I always think of them as a singles band. Certainly in the UK, they had a load of hits, lots of top 10 hits, a number one, so very big singles band. But they're also actually a very big album band as well, which is quite unusual. If you get a band that's got a lot of single hits, they don't tend to have a lot of album hits. But in the UK, they've had 25 top 10 albums from 1972 through to 2019. And one of the stats that really amazed me when I was looking into it was they've had over 500 weeks on the UK album chart. So that's nearly 10 years. Nearly 10 years out of a period of 20, sort of 40 years. So almost a quarter of that period had at least one Status Quo album in the charts during that period, which is a phenomenal statistic,
Phenomenal.
really, I think.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So as well as being a singles band, that I also think of them as an album band. Over in the UK, they're definitely thought of as national treasures. They're known not just by the rock community, they're known not just by the music, people who follow music. If certainly back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, my nan would have known about them, my parents would have known about them, they would have appeared on all sort of variety shows on the telly. So, and even now, it'd be very hard to find anybody, I think, over the age of 20 who doesn't know Status Quo. So they're more than just that kind of typical rock band or music sort of pop band. I think they're almost celebrities in their own right. But having said that, though, they're definitely a rock band at heart, in my view. Almost through all of the eras of Quo, you still got that. You get the sense that they're a rock band, the guitar band, more than anything. They're definitely known for, as I said earlier, they've got a kind of signature sound, which is that three bar boogie, three chord boogie sound. But I've always thought they're more than that. I think those who summarise them as that are underestimating really what Status Quo are all about. And there's when you listen to the guitar solos, the introductions to songs, etc., they're actually a very smart, clever rock band as well as being that sort of typical boogie band. I think the songwriting is excellent, and I think that's one of the reasons they've had so many hits. They're one of the best live bands certainly I've ever seen, and I suspect one of the best live bands ever. And I think that's one of the reasons why even now they'll do a tour normally around Christmas, and they'll be playing arenas and they'll sell it out. The tour they'll sell out if they're at a festival, they'll be one of the main headliners. So they're still recognised as a huge live act. And then last but no means least, I always think they're a fun band. You know, you always listen to Quo and you're sort of smiling and you're nodding your head and foot tapping or whatever. You don't listen to Quo to be overly serious or to sort of get too into the sort of the lyrics or anything else. They're a fun band and a party band, really. So those were the 10 things that I kind of thought about. And it was odd, really, because when I actually applied those 10 things to the bands, to the albums I was looking at, I actually ended up with a different album altogether. So having sort of got that focused around what I thought Quo really meant to me. So the album I ended up with is this one, Blue for You.
Blue for You, right.
And the reason for that, so first of all, if you go with the look, there's the Quo look, the double denim. Okay, maybe a bit smarter than you'd normally expect, but definitely got the look. If you go to the inner sleeve, you've got that sort of signature heads down, head down minus boogie kind of look. Can you see that on the camera? Okay.
I can indeed. They're
So
getting down to business.
So before you even start, it's got that look to them. And then if you go to the album tracks themselves, and I won't run through all of them, but the first 3 songs, Is There a Better Way, Mad About the Boy, and Ring for a Change, are all that kind of signature Status Quo boogie rock. But they are actually quite different. The first one's sort of, I would say, so I'm looking for my notes here. Yeah, so the first one is quite heavy, quite fast paced. The second one's a slower song. I would say more commercial. Could have been a single, even though it wasn't. The third one, Ring of Change, again, is back to being a faster song, probably more heavy, not quite so commercial. So even though they have that signature Quo sound, they actually are quite distinct. And I think also that's quite interesting with this album is all Alan Lancaster, Francis Rossi, and Rick Parfitt. They all write for the album, so they've all written for the album. They tend to sing their own. They sing the songs they've written, so you get a slightly different sound in each of the songs because they do have a slightly different voice to them. So
we'll do a deep dive on some of those songs. Yeah. So thank you for that, Parish. In respect of my encounter with Status Quo in Australia, I had an awareness. They were pretty big over here in Australia, so a lot of their albums went to number 2, troubled the upper reaches of the charts. Boogie rock or shuffle boogie rock was pretty big business in Australia, what we call pub rock. So we had our pub variations of Status Quo with, say, Billy Thorpe and bands like Chain, really loud, very much based in the 50s, but modernized and sped up in that sort of 12-bar boogie shuffle. Yeah, I think Status Quo really fit like a glove into the Australian pub rock audience sensibilities because it was the sort of music that we used to see in the streets, in the local pubs. So there were quite a few bands, very big in the 70s. Rocking All Over the World was a huge hit. I had an awareness as a young kid. That was on a lot of compilation albums. Jump, maybe 7 or 8 years. Live Aid, turn on the TV.
Yes.
Wembley, who's the first band? Status Quo. Everyone talks about Queen. They were fantastic. Absolutely. But so was Status Quo. How hard is it to start and get the audience pumped up at midday? When you're in a festival, the worst time slot to play is at midday. The beating sun. You haven't got the atmosphere of sundown and the night, and they rock the joint. And,
they absolutely did, yeah.
And for the world, especially America, where Status Quo could barely get arrested, it was their first encounter with this band, and they played magnificently. So that's my sort of
and I mean, just
Status
on
Quo
that,
experience.
yeah, just on that, Peter. I mean, Bob Geldof says that he always knew from the outset he wanted Status Quo to kick off Live Aid, partly because of the song, because the song obviously fit the theme, but for the very reason you just said, he needed a band that was going to lift everybody, get everybody sort of pumped up. And you may or may not be aware, but Quo had essentially split up at that point. They'd already announced that they were splitting up. I think they had one tour that we're going to go out and do as their farewell tour. And it was Bob Geldof that convinced them to do the gig, which actually then convinced them not to split up. So it's, so Live Aid is a big part of the Quo story, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a number of other bands that I think Bob Geldof was trying to get into Live Aid that were sort of contemporaries of Status Quo, but he couldn't get them. Thin Lizzy, he couldn't get them because Phil Lynott was in that different space. Slade, I don't know what they were up to. They may have disbanded or that they just sort of went over the hill. Status Quo was, of that ilk, because when you think about London, there wasn't any hard rock or heavy metal bands. In Philadelphia, there was quite a few. You had Judas Priest, etc., etc. But Status Quo were the only band that were waving the flag of rock. All the rest were kind of synth pop, new wave, and the uber rock stars like your Bowies.
Other than Queen, as you mentioned earlier, Queen were the only other rock band on the bill.
I still think Queen in that era were more pop in my head.
Well, they were. That's true. Yeah, they were. Yeah.
But a true rock band, I think Status Quo were kind of the only ones. Very briefly, my next encounter with Quo was Alan Lancaster had relocated to Sydney, married an Australian, and he was playing in a lot of bands that I saw in the pubs. There was a particular band called the Party Boys, and they were fronted by John Swan, who's the brother of Jimmy Barnes, and they had members of the Angels. Paul Christie was in it from Mondo Rock. It was sort of like a super group of all the different Australian rock bands, and they had a couple of hits in the charts. So, and he also formed a band called the Bombers. So Alan Lancaster, I crossed paths with him many a time in those pub rock bands, and was always admiring his bass technique, just that thumping, driving, foot to the floor sort of bass. Anyway, cut to the chase. The album that I'm going to put up for Desert Island Quo is On the Level. So simply because it's got Down Down. I think it summarizes all the boogie shuffle, all the Status Quo sounds that you would want in one album. It's all packed here. There's a few ballads, there's a bit of lightness and shade, but Down Down is like a masterpiece. I'll talk more about that shortly. But there you go. We basically picked two albums in sequence, haven't we?
Yeah, well, we have, and interestingly, that was one of the three that I was originally thinking of. So I definitely agree. It's a good pick for to sort of to show people what Quo was all about, or is all about still, I guess.
Absolutely. All right. Well, why don't we go to you? Why don't you spotlight a song and just have a chat about it and what you like about it? Just a signature song off the album.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I suppose for the reasons I gave early on why I picked the album, what drew me to the album most of all was the two singles. So the two singles were Rain and Mystery Song. And the reason I was drawn to those singles or those songs in particular, is because whilst they sound like Quo, they don't sound like obvious singles. So if you took Rain, for instance, it's a fast-paced rock song, but it's not overly commercial. Yes, it's got a hook there, but it's not got quite the same chorus as a Down Down has or a Rocking All Over the World. And it's got a fantastic solo and middle middle section in the song. So quite different, I think. And they still play it live. So as I said earlier, one of the things about Quo is they're a great live band. Well, this song Rain is fantastic live. And then similarly, Mystery Song, again, not really a typical Quo song. Starts very slowly. You think it's going to be a ballad, then the boogie kicks in, builds up, gets really heavy, fantastic solo. And then just as it's tailing off, it kind of turns into a country song. And the last piece of it almost sounds like a country song. So and again, still played live now, has been a mainstay of the set. So two great singles, not typically Quo singles, although they do sound like Status Quo. Not the obvious tracks, I think, from the album for singles. Rain got to number 7, Mystery Song got to number 11. So they were relatively big hits. But as I say, not maybe what you typically think. So they were probably the two songs more than anything that made me decide to go with Blue for You as my choice for the album.
Lovely. That's nice. All right, 2 songs that I'll pick. Little Lady, which is the opener on the album. Yeah. It's a cracker of an opener. It's got the typical Status Quo blues shuffle, but the thing that I want to spotlight on this song is the bottom end of Alan Lancaster and John Coughlin. His drumming is extremely underrated. It's not flashy. It's in the pocket. And Parish, I would compare him a little bit to Phil Rudd. What Phil Rudd is
Absolutely.
to AC/DC, John Coughlin is the Status Quo.
Yeah.
Not flashy, stays in the pocket. And to be quite frank, a lot of flashy heavy metal drummers couldn't play like this because it's got to be very much in a certain way.
There's a groove to it, isn't there?
It's all groove. It's in the pocket and it drives the song along. One thing I like about this song, it's got the blues shuffle, and then 1 minute 28 seconds into the song, it goes into this quiet interlude. You've got this little sort of interesting guitar line. It gets all introspective, and then it just reverts and goes back to the shuffle, and it cranks up again. And that's what I like about Status Quo. And a lot of people don't realize. They just think it's very monotone. It's just foot to the floor, but they do a lot of light and shade. There's a lot of push and pull. There's a lot of dynamics in their song, and Little Lady has a lot of that. So I think it's a cracker of the opening. And I've got to talk about Down Down. It was I was surprised to know this is their only number 1 in the UK, Parish.
It was, yeah. Yeah, absolutely, it was.
This song I would describe, I wrote down wind up. It's a big wind up, It starts off, it builds, you know what I mean? And I read it goes at 180 beats per minute. And reading an interview with Rossi, he reckons that he always puts this song towards the end of the set because they've got to build up a little bit of sea legs before they start playing it, because it takes a lot out of the band. And there's some interesting sort of rhythmic dynamics in regards to it. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Status Quo copped a little bit of flack at Australia because we've got a supermarket chain called Coles, and they did some food commercials using Down Down, which and you had the guys from Status Quo playing their guitars to a supermarket jingle. So there are a lot of diehard Aussie fans that thought Status Quo have actually sold out. So I might even, edit this into the clip, into this show if I'm able to, and let the viewers overseas see it. But
that'd be really interesting.
They copped a bit of flack. Our supermarket chains for I think it was about 2 or 3 years were using Down Down as a part of the commercial. The premise was Down Down, the prices go down.
Oh, I see. Yeah, of course. Yeah, makes sense.
down, down, deeper down, 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 prices are down. We want everyone to see your saving and your savings for real. Down, down, and down they go. Again, 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 again. Prices are down, down, down. Prices are down, down, down. They're saying down.
Weird. Anyway, you got any honourable mentions or other songs off the album that you want to?
Yeah, so other songs that sort of are kind of typify for me Quo. You've got Blue for You, the song itself, which is more slower, bluesy song, maybe a little bit more old rock, old style rock and roll. And I think again, Quo do quite a lot of that across their albums, where they're not so much that fast, revved up boogie rock. They do that. Their roots are still very much back in the 50s, I think, and people like Chuck Berry and that kind of sound. So you quite often get that sort of more traditional rock and roll. It's normally revved up a bit, but you can still hear it there. And also the blues is a big part of them, and that sort of slow blues sound. So I think Blue for You is a good example of that on that album. Another one that I think is really good, and I wrote it down for the very reason you've just said earlier, actually, is a song called That's a Fact. Because whilst it's typical Quo, it's really got a groove to it. The drumming and rhythm section on it, and actually they remind me also of AC/DC in that sense. I mean, of course there's a similarity, I guess, in the fact they're both boogie rock, but they're quite different, I think, in their styles. But that sort of groove, the rhythm section that holds it all together, that drives the songs along, I think is very similar. And so That's a Fact for me on this album, Blue for You. I think it kind of sums that up and is typical of that sort of Quo sound, really.
Absolutely. You'd have to say AC/DC must have heard a bit of Quo in their early stuff. I was just talking to my wife about Quo because I was doing this show, and I said, look, AC/DC, especially those early Bon albums, it's slower. It's a slower version of Quo. They slowed down the boogie shuffle, but they must have been, listening.
Well, I mean, it is interesting because when I was writing the list of what Quo means to me, I wrote down influential to start with, although I kind of didn't use it in the end, and because I don't know how many bands they legitimately influence, because you don't hear many people say I was influenced by Quo per se, but there's no doubt in my mind in the UK that if there wasn't a Quo, AC/DC would have found it harder to break into the market. There's no doubt in my mind that bands like ZZ Top and Skynyrd, who, if in most cases American bands didn't come across in the 70s, you didn't, Aerosmith wasn't big over here, Kiss wasn't big over here. But the two that did was Leonard Skynyrd and ZZ Top. And I think that's because there was a sound that was similar to Status Quo. So they kind of, people associated that music, even though they may not have been influenced by Quo. I think Quo had a big influence on their success, if that makes sense.
I'll go one further. Oasis.
Yeah.
A lot of that Britpop. Listen to Oasis.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've got the boogie, and it's not too many degrees of separation from classic Quo.
No. I mean, the funny thing was the only band I could find that actually outright quoted that Quo was a huge influence on them was a band that I wouldn't have associated at all, and that was Haircut 100. So they said the biggest influence on them was Quo, and in fact, apparently they used to play Down Down in their set during the 80s as an encore. And yet you wouldn't associate the sound, but obviously there was something that inspired them and influenced them to be a band in the first place.
Well, decidedly unfashionable. The critics didn't like them, but everything goes in cycles. Parish, in about 50 years, people will look back at Quo and go, "Wow, this is a band that needs rediscovering." Everything goes in cycles.
Well, it does. But again, you think about fashions. Quo have been consistently certainly in the UK, in the singles chart and in the album chart for over 50 years. So it's almost not mattered about what the fashion is and what's popular. They seem to have this ability, maybe because they've just got a loyal fan base, but whatever it is, they've been able to just sort of fight through the fashions, through the trends, and just keep going.
Absolutely. I'll talk about in a moment. I'll spotlight some songs off my album, and then I'm going to throw over to you about the reunion gig and just give you a little bit of a few questions on that. Some other songs I'd like to sort of spotlight on this album on the level is Over and Done, which is an Alan Lancaster penned song. It's got this canned heat countrified feel. Status Quo have a lot of country. People say, oh, that's a bit strange, but they do. And it's got nice harmony lines. And I really enjoy that song. So that, for a desert island Quo, a bit of variation. That's a good song to listen to. Bye Bye Johnny finishes off with a Chuck Berry song. So go back directly to the source of who their inspiration is. And a lot of this, as I said, a lot of the guitar lines and the 12-bar blues goes back to the golden age of rock and roll, and what a way to finish the album with a Chuck Berry song. What else? Most of the Time, I like that. That's got a country lilt, heartfelt lyrics. Look, I just think top to tail, this is a really, really strong album. But, for the people that like their crunch and like the boogie and the shuffle, it's got the signature hits of Down Down and Little Lady, and that's why I sort of nominate it. I'll throw it over to you. You saw the reunion gig 2013. What was it like?
Well, it was really good. So my history of seeing Quo was I saw them in 81, which was that original 4 lineup. I then saw them in 82, and I think Alan Lancaster was still there, but John Cogland had moved on, and there was a new drummer. And then I saw them in 90, where it was a different. You still have Rick Parfitt and Francis Rossi, but the rest of the band was different. So there was a lot of excitement about the return of the Frantic Four, and one of the reasons for it was it wasn't like the Kiss reunion. Everybody knew it was a one-off. It was a one-off tour. They weren't splitting the old band up and reforming. It was a one-off tour. So everybody knew this was kind of the last chance to see that original lineup. And I saw them, I think it was at Hammersmith Odeon. So it was it's still a big venue. It's sort of 4,500, but previous concerts I'd seen them at Wembley Arena, which is sort of 12,000. So it was quite a small venue in that respect. And I had really good seats. But it was just really good to see them back together again. You could tell they were enjoying it on stage. Whatever lawsuits had happened during the years and the fallouts, there was no sign of any of that at all. And in fact, at the time, I thought it might become a permanent fixture because they just seemed to be enjoying themselves so much on stage. And they seemed to be, sort of like a proper band, really. And so I was a bit surprised it didn't continue, but I guess that was always the intention. I think they only played the hits from that lineup. I might be wrong. They may have played 1 or 2 early 80s songs that were after John Coglan left. I can't remember now. But they certainly didn't play any of the latter stuff. They didn't play anything from In the Army Now. So, certainly my recollection anyways, they didn't play anything from In the Army Now onwards, which was sort of the new Quo, if you like, that was formed. So it was all the old classics. And it was fantastic. And as I say, I thought at the time it might become a sort of a regular thing every couple of years or whatever, they'd get back together again. But sadly not.
Wasn't to be. But Alan Lancaster apparently was suffering from MS, and I think it was a real testament to his will that he got through those shows. And maybe that's why they did it. And maybe that's why they did it. But I mean, I can't remember now. But I've got I had a feeling one of them wasn't well, and I couldn't remember which one. And I think maybe that was part of the reason. They knew themselves if they didn't do it then that they probably never would. So yeah. But any views on the status quo of the 80s onwards? Because I think we have both chosen for Desert Island Quo the 70s. So would we be on the same page to say that's the classic era to, in respect of
Oh, well, absolutely. So
their discography?
You spoke about your introduction to Quo. So my introduction was Paper Plane. That's the first song I remember hearing on the radio, seeing them on Top of the Pops. And then from that point onwards, the first album I bought was If You Can't Stand the Heat, which I think was 77. So that was the first album I bought. And I used to play in the late 70s and the early 80s. I played in a pub rock band that sort of gigs around North London and the Northern Home Counties. I was a drummer. And we used to play Paper Plane and Down in the Dust Pipe as regulars in the set. And if we turned up to a pub and the audience were a bit lukewarm or even hostile in some cases, you'd play a few Quo songs and you soon turned them around and got them on board. So yeah. I've always had that sort of association, the love for Quo, for the 70s stuff. Didn't mind the early 80s stuff, but certainly when it got to In the Army Now, I dropped out at that point, and I really didn't listen to them during the 80s or 90s. And I didn't get back on board again until the 2000s with the Heavy Traffic album, which I think was about 2002, something like that, which I think is a really good album. And then from then onwards, there are some really good albums during that period. So Quid Pro Quo, I think, is a really good album. And even the last album, Backbone, is pretty strong as well. So that period from sort of 85 to 2000, I never listened to any of that. It's just doesn't turn me on really. But from as I say, from Heavy Traffic onwards, then I think they start to get a return to form, and there's some really good songs amongst them. The albums might be a bit patchy, but there's enough on there to definitely sort of have a listen. And I'd say there's probably half the album is normally worth, sort of pretty good stuff. And then there's three, with the ones that said Heavy Traffic, Quid Pro Quo, and Backbone, where I think generally the whole album is a pretty good album.
Any thoughts on Pictures of Matchstick Men?
Yeah, I mean, it's odd really, because it's hard to associate it as the same band, isn't it? So I mean, I think it's a good song. It's really typical of its time as a psychedelic. You watch the clip of them on YouTube of them, and you can see it's them, but they look so different in what they're wearing. And it's very difficult to feel it's the same band really. It's almost, even though it's exactly the same members. So I like the song, but I would never, even if you asked me to name top 10 Quo songs, I'd never include it, not because I don't like it, because I just don't think it's Quo really.
Yeah, well, it's really funny. It's like Deep Purple Mark 1, Mark 2 was just a vast difference. It's sort of like the change of sound, but at least in Mark 1, you still had that Ritchie Blackmore, you still had that little bit of, you could see that there was a bit of a lineage.
Yeah.
But with Pictures of Matchstick Men, you can't really, it's completely different.
It is,
and they sort of like, they just twisted it around, changed their sound completely. Question to you. They were big in Australia. They were big in certain parts of the Southern Hemisphere. Why did they never make it in America? Have you got a theory on this?
Well, I have a joke theory and I have a real theory. So my joke theory is, I think that British bands that start with the letter S don't make it in the States. So you've got Status Quo, you've got Slade, you've got Sweet, you've got Stereophonics. It just seems to be a thing that
Saxon.
Bands that are Saxon, bands that are absolutely huge in the UK, if they start with S, they don't make it. They don't translate at all to the States. So that's the joke answer. The real answer is, it is a bit like the Slade thing. I just think there's something about the humour. There's something about the almost that knees up sort of musical sound to it that just doesn't get picked up on by the Americans. They just don't, for whatever reason, just don't like it. And it is a puzzler, because they're not that different from AC/DC, who were huge. They're not that different from a Leonard Skinner or a ZZ Top. They've got that similar sound, but I can only think there's just a Britishness in there that for some reason doesn't translate. And particularly in the 70s, the music scene did seem to be polarized. There was a lot of big bands in the States that never made it in the UK. You think REO Speedwagon, Styx, Journey, those, Kansas, those bands never, I mean, they did early 80s for one or maybe one album, but generally never translated across. And likewise, you've got a lot of UK bands that never made it across to the States, the ones we mentioned, but you've also got bands like The Jam. They didn't make it across there at all. So you've got a lot of bands that I just think the musical environment was different. What people like to view live, what they like to listen to was just very different. And but Quo's an interesting one because actually musically, I think they're not that different from a lot of bands, that were big in the States. So yeah, it's a bit of a puzzler, but what do you think?
Oh, look, yeah, it didn't translate because I think they were probably too English. And for the same reason, a lot of Australian bands never made it over to America because they were too localized and to Australian. But sonically, they're not that far out of the wheelhouse with a lot of those Southern boogie bands, Southern rock. So maybe if they put, cowboy hats and changed
maybe
the denim suits into something a little bit more countrified, it may have translated. But, small fish in a big pond or huge fish in a small pond. I mean, they're big in England. They could sell out Wembley a couple of times. Why did they need to go to LA?
Well, and they were also pretty big in Europe as well. I mean, they were big in France, they were big in Germany, Scandinavia. Yes. So they had a big market. And let's be fair, they did all right for themselves. So they probably didn't need the money. So
yeah, absolutely. So my final question, with 2024 ears and a lot of hindsight, does this this album that you've chosen sound contemporary and fresh? Or does it sound more of an artifact of 1974, 75?
I think it sounds quite fresh. I mean, one of so I mentioned I was looking at the same album that you picked, but I also was considering Whatever You Want, and also If You Can't Stand the Heat. And the reason for those were probably because they're the two of my favorite albums. But again, they sounded more of the time. There was a production sound that I felt sounded very late 70s. And I think it's because they had outside producers. Whereas on Blue for You, and I think also on The Level, they actually produced it themselves. And therefore, I don't think it sounds quite the same dated.
Produced by Status Quo. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, well, there you go. So from that point of view, I don't think they were whiz kids in the studio, I don't think they were using all the techniques and all the tropes that were current at the time. So I think it does sound pretty current. It's still quite fresh. They almost sound like live albums. I know they're not, but they almost sound like live albums. And I think therefore the production stands up pretty well. As I say, the songs stand up, I think, quite well still. They still play two of them live regularly. So yeah, I think unlike some of the next few albums, which I think do sound dated with, looking back, I certainly think the one I picked, and I think the one you picked, I mean, you'll say your view in a moment, but I think the one you picked is the same. It kind of is more, sort of has more of a sound that isn't dated and translates to today.
Yeah, I agree. I think they've got a sound of their own. They're like of their own entity, but it doesn't date, because when you mine something sonically that goes back to the classic days of rock and roll, it sounds fresh. It sounds now. It's when you get caught up in the technology and the sounds of a particular era, that you're prone to be dated.
Exactly.
So it's just organic, four on the floor, stonking, boogie shuffle. And it just sounds contemporary. It sounds now, and it's got a groove. And if those folk that love their rock that has a bit of swing and a bit of groove to it, this is the album for you. So, all right. Well, you put your album up. I'll put my album up. One more for the road. And this is the Parish and Pete's pick for the album Status Quo, On the Level and Blue for You as the Desert Island Status Quo.
Quick aside, I don't know, I think it's the same in all of the albums, but I love the fact that they've got these at the bottom that show you the also from, exactly. And I just think that's great. So you can pick up any album and know where it is in the sequence of all the albums that they did.
Have not noticed that. I noticed that there was something there, but I haven't really. Yeah, that's great.
On my one, for instance, on Blue for You, you can see the last one.
Yep.
Is on the level.
Yep.
So so minor thing, but I just things like that amuse me. I think that things like that, attention to detail that bands have. I love all of that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Parish. You can see Parish on Rock on the Contrarians. Just type in the word Parish of Rock and you'll see him there. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Click the bell. Tell us what your favorite Status Quo album is. What do you think of our picks? Your favorite Status Quo moments. But one thing's for certain, you'll see the Parish on the channel during the course of 2024, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Excellent. Bye-bye.